So welcome to this FemQuant panel on peer review. We have three speakers today. We have Ridhi Kashyap, who is a professor of demography and computational social science at the University of Oxford in the United Kingdom. Ridhi has been an editorial committee member of Population and Development Review since 2022 and was also one of the co-editors of the 50th anniversary special issue of PDR that was published in 2025, in addition to also having served as the deputy editor of demography from 2023 to 2026. We also have Wendy Manning, who is a distinguished professor of sociology at the Bowling Green State University in the United States. Wendy has served as a co-guest editor in the Journal of Family and Theory Review special issue, as a deputy editor in the American Sociological Review, and as an editorial board member of the American Sociological Review, Demography, as well as Population Research and Policy Review. And then we have Rin Reczek, who is a professor in the Department of Sociology at Ohio State University in the United States. Rin is currently an editorial board member of Socius, Demography, the Journal of Health and Social Behavior, the Journal of Gerontology B-Series, the Journal of Marriage and Family, Journal of Family Issues, and Sociological Focus. Rin has previously been a deputy editor at the Journal of Marriage and Family and editor in charge at Innovation in Aging. Okay, the panel will discuss a series of questions regarding on how to prepare one's manuscript for submission, how to deal with peer reviews, and what happens after submission and after the work has been published. And without any further ado, I will ask the first question. So the first question is about kind of what happens before you submit. So when writing a manuscript, how and when do you decide to choose your target journal? And how does this affect how you package your results and write up the front end of your paper? And I will ask Ridhi to jump in first on this one.
Great. Thanks very much, Heini. So I think, at least from my perspective, when writing up a manuscript, I think you should sort of start thinking about your target journal fairly early in the process. Because the way I like to sort of think of a journal is it's really, you're writing a piece and you want that piece to be in conversation with some ideas. You want it to be in conversation with sort of a set of work already. And it's helpful to think about where that conversation is happening. And it often may be in a journal or a set of journals. So if you think of your work as very much in dialogue with others, then a journal can be sort of the home or the place for where that dialogue is happening. And I think you have, that's one way that you can sort of think about framing your work and also engaging with existing work. At least when I'm writing papers, I always like to think about, a few key references, not a very large number. Sometimes that can be even just one paper, but, 1 to say 5 papers that you feel that are really, really important or influential in sort of helping you think about this topic and also shaping how you're going to write about it. And so I think thinking also about where that is happening vis-a-vis a journal or a set of journals can be helpful. I also think it's important to be flexible, though. Like, it's good to have one target journal, but also have some degree of space in thinking about maybe a few different options. Often, these things are quite sort of, often the writing style doesn't need to change very much, especially if you're sort of going through a series of target journals. But in some cases, it may require, reformulation or reprioritization of certain areas over others. So, as I said, I think it's important to be flexible, but I do think it's important that you start thinking about sort of target journals early on in the process, because ultimately we're sort of writing to be in conversation with a scientific field or an area. And I think it's really important that we start thinking about where those conversations are happening so that we can make our own intervention through our pieces.
Thank you. Is there anything that the other panelists would like to add?
Sure, I can jump in. I agree with everything that Ridhi says. I think there's other pieces that I look at when I'm thinking about holistically the types of journals I'm publishing in, maybe across a 5-year span. So to add to this, I would say I have a tendency to try to publish in the same journal over and over. And it's something I had to fight against, because I think a journal doesn't want to just, be publishing your work over and over. You want to have a diversity of outlets that you're publishing in. And I think that often depends on your, home department or wherever, if you're trying to get tenure or publish in a certain place. These are important things to consider. And so for myself, I often have to work. Anyone looking at my CV will see JMF is like my favorite outlet. And I often have to say, I know this is a JMF paper, but I just published there, or I just submitted there. And I need to kind of think about, okay, what about for an aging audience? Is there a little sort of twist that I can make about this, for example? And so there's, I think it's about like your idea and where you want it to go. And then also, the sense of flexibility of it doesn't, try not to be too rigid, and this is where this paper needs to go. The other thing I'll add, and I think we can talk a little bit about it later, is taking a look at the editor and the editorial board that's listed, and at all of the public facing website stuff that's showing up on each of these journals. Because they actually, having created some of this content, I do feel like it's very purposeful that there's often, maybe not always, but often intentionality that goes into, for example, when an editor takes over, they'll write a note about, hey, these are the kinds of things I'm really interested in. They'll often leave information in those editorial notes when they start editing a journal. Who they invite to be on the editorial board or as deputy editors is a really important signal. You can go and look at who that is, look at some of their work, and see what kinds of things they are supporting and interested in. It doesn't mean if they don't publish feminist work or quantitative work that you can't submit there by any means. But I think it should be kind of, you're just getting the clues that are being laid out. And the same thing looking at the journal, the recent articles that have been published under that editor is a really good signal for, okay, these are the types of things that the folks here are really most interested in.
Wendy.
And I can just add a couple comments. I think this is really great advice. One is also to consider special issues of journals. Those are really cueing you into what they want to see. And so I think that's very helpful. And there are not always as many papers submitted to the special issues as you might imagine. And so they're under a tight time frame, and they need to find a set of articles that sort of are coherent and tie together and speak to one another. And so I highly recommend that as a strategy. And another, when you're selecting a journal and you're submitting it to a journal, be sure to cite people who have published recently in that journal. Now, you don't want to just put in cites that are meaningless, but those are the people who are going to be asked to review your paper. And so if it doesn't have to be spot on, but if it's just somewhat related to your topic, I would be sure to read that person's work and see what their perspective and angle is, and cite their work, or be sure to address that perspective when you're submitting, because that's something that I learned as I got more senior and was in more of these roles, and it just makes sense. It's like, oh, I kind of owe the journal a favor because I just published in there, so I'm going to be asked to be a reviewer, and it's hard to say no. So I recommend that as well.
Any last word from anyone until we move on to the next question? Okay, so the next question is actually a bunch of questions, but that are sort of asking similar things. So it's mostly about how do you speak to different audiences? So how do you embed your theory section into feminist literature while appealing to the broader audience in line with journal ambitions? And then kind of on the other side, so this is the feminist side and then there's the quantitative side. Any advice for writing up quantitative results that are understandable to both queer and feminist scholars who may not be so familiar with the methods, as well as quantitative scholars who may not engage with queer and feminist theory? So we'll go with Rin first, and then the others can add some.
Great. I'll just take a piece of that, and then my co-panelists can pick up the slack. So one thing I would say to this broader question is, you've already now developed a sense of the audience. So who am I speaking to? And part of that, really nitty-gritty part of that, is looking at the articles and reverse engineering what they did. So I usually encourage folks, including myself, when I'm especially looking at a new outlet, to figure out what's their like system of engaging with literature. How do they talk about theory? What kinds of theories are they talking about? And that will just give you a sense to reverse engineer like the front end of a paper, for example. Do they like to be really explicit and have like a theory section? Or do they like it to be a little bit more subtle? And you're just working it in as an explanatory factor. And I think that's true. Like, I think about like demographic publishing in demography, for example. You do need pretty explicit theory, I find, and when I've worked published there, to guide the research, whereas other places are less invested in that. And so I think that's like the best advice I can give, is to go to that journal and look at how papers, the kind of formula. Once you figure out the formula, it's a little bit easier to sort of then work in your area to manage, like, how do I want to structure this, and how do I want to incorporate theory? The other piece I'll say about the theory is that, especially from a feminist, using feminist theory, the question that I would encourage folks to ask themselves is, what needs to be explicit and what is sort of more implicit? For me, I often don't say I use a feminist perspective. It's implicit in a lot of my work. And people may disagree with that. Depends on the outlet that I'm looking for. What is most helpful and legible to the actual project that I'm working on? I would argue that all of my work is from a feminist and queer lens, but I don't always explicitly say that. And so I think that is also another, that's a personal question. That's a question in terms of like how you want to frame your own work. It's a question that depends on the audience and the journal. So maybe that's my hedging response to that. And I'm curious what my colleagues say.
Any reactions from the other panelists?
I think that's great advice. And just to take a little spin off that is, you're sometimes speaking to these different audiences, and it's really important that you're very transparent and clear in your use of language. So there's some things that are very implicit that maybe everybody who studies something from a certain perspective, everybody knows that. But if you're outside that, you don't know it. And you could be a cranky reviewer and like, you're using these terms I don't understand. And so I have found in the work that I've done, I've had to really be very clear to define terms. And so that can range from defining what I mean when I'm talking about maybe sexual identity and being very explicit about that. And maybe that's how the question was asked in a survey. I might not agree with that, but that's the term I'm going to use, because it just, people get very caught up in that, and you don't want to turn off a reviewer immediately. You want them to say, oh, okay, I get that, and keep reading your paper. And so sometimes I've found that people can be easily sort of put off by that. And also by defining your terms and being really transparent, I think you can help engage more people. Otherwise, you feel like, sometimes I read papers, I feel like I'm entering the middle of a conversation that I don't know the beginning of, and I have no context to understand it because it's not my exact area, but I feel like I could offer something. And so I think don't be afraid of being very transparent. And sometimes we use these terms and theories and as a crutch or as a shortcut to quickly try to move through the paper, but that won't help you if you're trying to speak to broad audiences. So if you're focusing on a very specific audience, then that could work really well. But if you're going to a more general journal, you're going to run into issues along that front. So that was just a slight addition. So I'm sure Rita has more.
Yeah, so I mean, I very much agree with this idea of sort of, in thinking about appealing to broad audiences, while at the same time sort of, making sure you can get sort of feminist and queer work out there. I think it's really important also to, as Wendy said, to like think about this as to be transparent, to sort of be clear, and to sort of minimize jargon in a way that can allow also diverse audiences to both understand and engage with the work and build with it, right? I mean, if we think about it, there's huge payoffs to having feminist and queer work in general journals because it makes this more mainstream. And that's what we want. And we want this to be a part of just the regular conversation in these fields. And so there's a great opportunity for us through that vehicle to sort of make this, more visible, more widespread. And so I think, one tool that I often use, especially if I'm writing in a way that I fear that may be less accessible to others, is I often will ask within my network people from very different backgrounds to read that work. So I may ask, for example, friends who do more qualitative work to read things that are written in a more sort of quantitative way, where I feel they may be sympathetic to the message, but maybe they might find some parts of it hard to parse. So just trying to think about not just, don't just get the people who already know the methods and they're sympathetic to the argument to read it. Also push yourself to find others in your networks, whether that's in your cohort of graduate students, whether that's your mentors and advisors. Just try and find people from different perspectives to read the work. And also, I often do this. I often get, for example, just, family members to read papers that I think might be interesting, but they don't know very much the technicality of. And I think that's really, that's something that, as social scientists, we do have a sort of comparative advantage of, that at least the topics are interesting to a lot of people in our communities and in our societies, as opposed to, I don't know, if you were a cosmologist. The topic is interesting, but the papers are hard to understand. So I think it's, thinking a bit about how different eyes can sort of help make things more accessible and interpretable is a really important part of doing this. I also think that, there's also now sort of, one of the nice things about this broader community of sort of queer scholarship, feminist scholarship, or sort of critical demographic scholarship is that now we're at that sort of nice stage where there is a lot of momentum. It is growing. So there is also now some precedent that can be drawn on and amplified, right? So feel free to sort of read and engage with that work, and also use your work to make bridges between that new work, that sort of recent work, and your own work. And also try and, I often do this, is that, try and think about, while some of these things may be new, there may also be relevant parallels from past literatures, right? I mean, to give you an example, this is not directly linked to, say, feminist or queer work, but for example, in a lot of my recent work, I've been very interested in the last sort of decade in this question of the sort of implications of digital technologies for demographic outcomes. And, in a way, that's a new thing because it's about, the internet and social media and mobile phones and so on. But I always draw a parallel between that and like a long-standing literature on mass media, right? And so when I frame it like that, I say, well, why should demographers be interested in sort of internet or social media technologies? Well, I say, well, if we think about it, they've been interested in sort of television and radio and its impacts on fertility transitions for a really long time. And I think that kind of parallel, thinking, yes, this is new, but also showing that a lot of it is not new. It also speaks to bigger social science questions that we've been thinking about for a long time, can also be a good hook. I think I'll end with that thought.
Thank you. Any quick reactions? In that case, we'll move on to the next bit. So that's kind of like what happens after you've submitted your paper. So the first question in this section is, how do you deal with hostile reviewers, particularly if you're early in your career? And this is kind of, I will combine this with the other questions that I think are much related. So how do you decide which reviewer comments to push back on, particularly when the comments may recommend changes that are against feminist or queer aims of the paper? And I will ask Wendy to go first.
So this is a great question, and I've had some experience with this. And if you're co-authoring with a more senior person, I've had this with a student, it can be best if the senior person addresses the editor, not because you're not capable or you don't have important things to say. It's the senior person has less risk and they have a little more maybe sway with the editor to get their attention. And so I've done that where we had a very hostile review, and I contacted the editor and said I was shocked to receive this review. And then I can say, as an older person, in all of my years, I've never seen such a terrible review, and that gets an editor's attention, and it at least forces them to rethink it. And I requested that this person never be asked to review again for the journal. And we ended up resubmitting the paper. So that's sort of an extreme case. Sometimes, of course, the reviews are a little more subtly hostile, and I think those are a little harder to deal with. When it's really obvious, then you can kind of really stand up and say, this is wrong. The subtle ones are a little trickier. But I try, when I get reviews, is I try to make a list of all of the comments separate from the paper. I just make a list, and then I try to say yes more than no. So nobody wants to think that their comments weren't valuable or important. And I know it might be hard to do sometimes, but sometimes I say, reviewer one made a great point that this is a select sample. However, and then you kind of make your case. And so I try to say yes when I can. They're easy changes, or they're things that I think are valuable. There's some where I'm sort of saying yes, but really not saying yes. And then there's other times you really have to decide, this is a core part of my argument, and I'm not going to change it. And I can't, maybe it's impossible to change it, or it's not appropriate, or it changes your whole research question. So some work I've done where they're asking me, sometimes I'm looking at certain populations and folks always want to contrast to heterosexuals. And I'm sort of like, that's not the point of this paper. That's not what this is about. Of course, I might be able to do that, but that's not how it was crafted. And so I think if you can make a coherent argument, but it does feel risky to do that. And sometimes the way out of that is to say you did supplemental analyses. And so you're still saying yes, but it's getting kind of shifted to the supplement. So that's a couple ideas on that front.
Thank you. Any reactions from the other panelists?
I think that's great advice. I mean, I've often myself done this of just choosing supplementary or sort of adding it to the appendix, but sort of not really significantly changing the framing. I think one often other challenge that we encounter, and this one I think is a bit harder. So I think I agree very much with Wendy that when something is very overtly hostile, that you can even, read it, and it may be helpful to ask, if you have a senior colleague on the paper, to ask them to engage with the editor, or if you don't, it's also fine to write respectfully to the editor and say, and point out when things have been have been sort of, when they are hostile. I should note that, a lot of journals, I don't advocate using this on every submission. In fact, that is not at all what I'm saying. But journals do have appeals processes, especially if you find yourself if you find yourself subject to a hostile review and rejection, and you really do think that there's been a sort of a really severe, grave misunderstanding, and there is also, a hostile review that is driving the decision. All journals do have review processes, and I do think that you should of course use these sparingly, but when you do have a substantial case for a hostile review, this is exactly the kind of thing to use a journal review process for. And I can tell you on the editorial side, we discuss, we take those seriously. We do consider them and we evaluate them and sort of look at the context in which that is come about. And so I think, use the review process. But, sometimes with the more subtle forms of hostility, it's tricky because there may be sort of assumptions about, how a paper should be or what kinds of analyses are valuable, that are implicit sometimes in reviewer comments that sometimes you can't do very much about if you're studying, for example, queer populations, right? Like one thing that I've often encountered when I've submitted things around, minority groups or queer populations to demographic journals, and this really sort of shows because this is a demographic audience in particular, is, concerns around small sample sizes, the imprecision of the confidence intervals. And I'm like, yes, like fair. I mean, that's part of the challenges. Like not everyone has Nordic register data when studying queer populations, and all surveys do have small sample sizes. So it's a challenge. And so I think in a way that is, and that I see that, I interpret that as also a sort of a form of implicit hostility, because it's like sort of taking a certain view of what kind of analysis, what kind of science, and what kind of vision of science is desirable, and also a model for statistical analysis, and ways of deriving conclusions from it. So I think, in those scenarios, I have sometimes in reviewer comments where, for example, there have been concerns around small sample sizes or this is not a significant effect. I've tried to, for example, draw examples from the kind of sort of broader open science and replication crisis literature that has really tried to sort of dismantle this primacy of p-values and statistical significance, and said, look, we are now moving also in quantitative analysis away from this model of just sort of having significance above all else. And there's sort of a broader context within the scientific community that is forcing us to think about our analyses in different ways. So I think those are also opportunities, we can't get around it, but also if we respond in those ways in our reviewer responses, we're also in some sense broadening the conversation and sort of and at least dismantling some of the implicit assumptions about what is sort of, the appropriate and desirable analysis. So it's a slow process, but I think it's important that, those kinds of assumptions are also challenged, one step at a time.
I'll just add to that to say that I totally agree. And one of the ways that I've worked with that critique around small sample sizes, small population, why do we care about them? Queer people, right? They're so small, is to look at precedent in the journal. So it maybe not be queer people, it could be, certain racial ethnic groups, like kind of mapping in the same way about like changes in the way we think about statistical analyses to thinking about like, oh, this is an emerging field, or this is an emerging like way we're thinking about collecting data. This is something that, several years ago with this population, these things were being published in this journal. So you're looking for examples to set precedent for how you can make claims towards scientific scientific legibility, right, in the context of that particular journal. And that works really well. And you do that in the response to the reviewers. So my response to reviewers, people have different approaches to this, are very long, because I make a lot of those argumentations there. So I'll say like, this is like in the history of let's say you're publishing a demography published, these articles that had similar sample sizes. Here was the rationale that's used, and you're just kind of justifying it to the reviewers and the editors. That doesn't really go in the paper unless they ask. I'll often say that too, like, here's this supplemental analysis that speaks to this other comment, that you put things in supplemental analyses. You can put it in the response to the reviewers. Like, I can put this in the paper. Here's the analysis, but I actually really don't want to, but if you need me to, I will. And like, 9 times out of 10, they'll be like, okay, as long as we've seen it, we feel confident in that. And it goes to the same issue as well. So when you're thinking about how to push back against these delegitimizing comments, this is a really important way that you can do that. I think there's also like other ways, like pulling on the editorial statements, like just like subtle things that you pull into the response to the reviewers to say, actually, this reviewer is off base. This journal does value this kind of work, and here's why it's so important to the science in general. So that would be my addition to this. I'm trying to think if I had other. Oh, the other thing I want to say is that even if you don't have a senior person on the paper, in my view, it's completely okay to reach out to someone in your network that you're close to who is working in this area and probably has had these comments. Like I have stock stuff from my response to reviewers that I'm very happy to share with people like, oh, I got this comment. Like, how do you deal with that? And that's something that, as a community, I think we're very open about and want to help manage. And so please feel free to reach out if you have something like that. Again, it's the more subtle hostility, that questioning that is the trickiest part. And there's lots of effective ways to manage it in the response to the reviewers. So please reach out.
I still wanted to use my chair's privilege to add something that what Wendy was saying about you not having to change the core of your research. And I would also say, remember that there are always other journals. Like if this journal would require you to change something, a core part of your research, then obviously push back. If they still say no, then that's not the right outlet. Like you don't have to change everything. I know that it's difficult sometimes to get you want to publish, so you want to get it done, but at the same time, there are trade-offs sometimes. Okay, so then we will talk a little bit about what happens once the paper is published. So the question is, where are places that I could to disseminate your work so that you can reach audiences that may not typically read the journal that you published in? So for instance, how do you disseminate papers from demography or economics journals to LGBTQ plus audiences? And I think it is Ridhi's turn to start.
So I think, more broadly, I think I see this as a question about disseminating and outreach of work outside of just pure academic journals. And I think increasingly, especially if you're, there's a good chance that what you're going to be writing about could also have implications for different kinds of communities. So I think in addition to, I always sort of tell, when I try and do this myself to some extent, but I also try and encourage all my graduate students to do this, is to think about, spaces that could be, online forums or blogs or different kinds of, digests, different kinds of organizations. And of course, professional societies have digests through email or disseminated via other channels that allow you to, just do sort of broader promotion and outreach of the findings. So I think definitely think about that. Like in the UK, for example, we have The Conversation. That's, I think, a very nice outlet to do wider outreach and dissemination of some scientific work, of papers. Of course, professional journals have this, but it may be that itself is not, you're still reaching other researchers who might be, working in similar areas themselves or maybe interested in it. But, in some cases, there may also be value add to reaching out to specific communities, whether that's sort of charities, civil society organizations, or government bodies and organizations that are interested in that work, and of course, media and journalists as well. So first, in terms of working with media, I do think that, a number of universities do have press offices that have a list of contacts that could be useful to reach out to. So if you have a comms team at your institution, consider reaching out to them. Consider sort of promoting your work more widely on your departmental page if you have one, if that's an option that's available to you. Just writing an email, sort of sharing a lay summary of your findings to a comms teams, at the university can be a great way to potentially get your work also to other kinds of, media organizations. So that's one way, but also more targeted emailing and outreach to specific organizations that, you may have worked with or you may think may be interested in the work. Many times, in the vast majority of cases, you'll probably not get a response, but sometimes you just need one response for it to become something more for something meaningful. So for example, we did this recently at a paper where we've been with looking at Spain and looking at how Policy reforms around assisted reproduction technologies have affected parenthood among same-sex couples. And this project that I've been working on with Diederik Burton at the Center for Demographic Studies in Barcelona, we have actively taken these findings and sent them and engaged with queer groups around this, to sort of show them the impacts of these policy reforms on reducing parenthood amongst female same-sex couples. And I think and we actually found when we shared that with them, they said, well, this very much was aligned with what we're sort of hearing anecdotally. And it's really great to see the empirical evidence lines up at the sort of, using the Spanish census. And so I think there kind of, we didn't have to do that, right? We could have just written that paper, put it up and said, okay, now, but the fact that, we thought that this could be a part of a broader social campaign, that we think this is really important work also for civil society groups and charities that are working in this sector, meant that we sort of made that extra effort of reaching out, sending them a draft, not of the paper, but like a sort of a lay summary with a kind of a finding through a visual. So anyway, so that's just sort of set of thoughts, use communications teams if you have them at your institution. Think about also other forms of outreach and visibility, sort of writing lay summaries of your work and promoting them in different ways, including social media. And also think about, who are the other kind of stakeholders in this ecosystem for whom these findings could be relevant, and don't be afraid to reach out to them and engage with them directly.
Thank you. Rin.
Yeah, I love all that. I think those are great ideas. The only thing I would add is that it's completely okay to email other researchers your work, and don't spam people, but you have a paper that's relevant in someone's area, you cite them, you engage in their work. Like, that is wonderful. I really actually appreciate when that happens. Like, people send me things that they think I might be interested in that they've written. It's not, I know that maybe may feel very, to use the term, cringy, but actually it's so helpful because we don't always know what's being published in the areas that we are reading in, especially if it's in a journal that isn't, necessarily one that we typically read. And so I just want to encourage you to do that. I think often, right, if I talk to you at a conference and then you follow up with a paper, this is great. This is really important. And so that can be more widespread, depending on the types of articles that you're publishing. So it can speak to, everything about this sort of external audience, but even, I publish in demography, but I know that like queer people, in this area aren't reading demography, and I'm sending it to that set of researchers. I think that is okay to do and even really helpful.
And Rin, when you were speaking, it reminded me of, you had posted on social media, I think, a book chapter, and it was something I would have never probably come across. And then I emailed you and you sent me the book chapter, and so it was very helpful because we're not all reading especially book chapters, I think really are very valuable and sometimes are hidden. It's hard to find them. So if you have those, that's helpful. And I agree. I am happy to receive papers from people. I love to see them. I love for people to point things out, or they might say, I think you might be interested in this. It doesn't even have to be their work in particular. Another idea, though, is for the NChat, we have a newsletter. And so subscribe to the newsletter. Here's my ad for that. And then if you publish using the data, tell us, and then we'll send it out on the newsletter, and it goes out to many more people. And so anything like that you can do, or like Ridhi was saying, different groups like Council in the United States, the Council on Contemporary Families often is posting out articles. And if there's somebody that you're, I find social media takes up a lot of time to really be great at it. But if there's somebody you're following and you think the paper is really related, I've seen people repost other people's papers. And so they amplifying their work. So somebody like a Philip Cohn or Karen Guzzo does this a lot. If she sees a paper, then she'll repost it. And these are people who are very active and have very big audiences. I'm not as big in that space, but I find that can be very helpful. And I don't think those folks would mind receiving receiving your work. So, and I really applaud this kind of activity because there are so many journals now, and it is and there's so much out there. It's hard to capture what's really related and meaningful and high quality sometimes, and so I find this very helpful.
Thank you so much. This was the last question that we had pre-prepared.